Hello, welcome to a special edition of the Tennessee Informer. I'm your host, Dave Vance. Our special guest today is David Rogers Webb, author of the book, The Great Taking, which among other things exposes little known but factual changes to financial regulations that leave investors much more vulnerable to loss than they realize. He's a former financial industry professional with a background in managing public equities and hedge funds. His experience spans critical financial events such as the Asian financial crisis and the dot-com bubble and bust. He currently resides on a small farm near Stockholm. He's gracious enough to join us today. However, we are having some connection issues, so hopefully he'll be with us here in just a few. In the meantime, I'll just cover some preliminaries. Going to go over ads and updates with you for now. If you have an announcement that you want, I'm just going to remind everybody I'm still having some vision issues, so I'm going to have to read this one off of here. If you have an announcement from a conservative organization that you'd like to broadcast on this show, please send their information to tninformer.tv@gmail.com the Friday before the show. If you want our state to stand up to federal overreach, the best way to do that is support the nullification process bill sponsored by Senator Bowling and Representative Halsey that they intend to bring back next session. Visit tncss.weebly.com/call to action. Sign the petition and follow the instructions on the link. Our state senators and reps need to know we want this legislation passed. They will return in January, so we need to have a lot of signatures to turn in for Senator Bowling and for Representative Halsey to give to the legislature to show that people really want this. Now's the time to get the candidates for state office on record, where they stand on this issue. Just remember, D.C. will never fix D.C. Only the states can fix D.C. And we're going to have to demand that the states stand up and uphold their oath to the Constitution, both the state and U.S. Constitution. The Murray County Reagan Day event will be Friday, June 14th, 6 p.m. at Puckett's Restaurant in Columbia, Tennessee. The guests include Todd Starnes, Representative Andy Ogles, Representative Tim Burchett, and Tony Lauren. Tickets are $100. Go to murraytngop.com for details. Okay, I'm going to have to make a few adjustments here since we're still waiting for David to join us. So we've got a video. He actually testified on a bill that was in the Tennessee legislature earlier this session. And we've got some video of him testifying to the Civil Justice Committee on the legislation, House Bill 2806 by Halsey and House Bill 2640, or Senate Bill 2640 by Lundberg. So we're going to roll the tape. You're going to hear David Webb speaking and explaining the need for this legislation. And then there is another guy who's also in support of the legislation, Mr. Gandhi, I think is his name. And then we're going to you'll hear one of the legislators ask some questions. So we're going to roll that, and hopefully he'll be with us here in just a few minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak with you. I'll begin by saying for 400 years, securities were personal property.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is David Webb. I am a U.S. citizen. I am now looking at land in Tennessee, but that's another matter. So I'll begin by saying for 400 years, securities were personal property. Now, what that meant was if your account provider, your broker or your custodian became insolvent, you could take immediate return of your securities. That is no longer the case. Now, you no longer have property rights to securities. What you have is a newly created concept implemented through the Uniform Commercial Code of a security entitlement. This is not a direct property right. This is a contractual claim to your own property that is very weak in the event of insolvency. The other thing that's very important is that all securities are held in these massive pools, in pooled form at a higher level. They are not legally held at your broker or your custodian. They are held in massive pools at Depository Trust Corp. Now, the securities in these pools, because there's no specific identification of the investor to any security, they're not numbered, these pools are available for the securities industry to use without restriction for proprietary trading within the securities complex, within the industry. So what the situation is that people can be told that their securities are segregated at the broker level. It's just in the books and records of the broker. The subterfuge is that they are being used at a higher level in the system, where the secured creditors actually have ownership over the securities. Now, how do we know this? We know this irrefutably because the Deputy General Counsel of the New York Federal Reserve responded to a questionnaire from something called the EU Legal Certainty Group, so it was a formal legal response that explains the operation of the UCC. So this is not conjecture. It's from the highest source possible explaining how this works. And the Fed makes it clear that even segregated.
Mr. Webb, that's your 3 minutes. So we'll get we'll take Mr. Grande's, and then we'll take questions after he gets there. But just hang in there for me for 3 minutes. Mr. Grande, if you'll just identify yourself, and you'll have 3 minutes.
My name is Don Grande. I am a private practice attorney and been working on this issue for quite a while with regard to the Uniform Commercial Code and more specifically to this issue. So in a nutshell, as Mr. Webb has talked about, with the 1994 Article 8 revision, they conjured a new type of property ownership or property right called a securities entitlement. The drafting committee defines a securities entitlement as a bundle of personal rights you hold against your broker. So if I hold rights against someone else, that's a contract. So it isn't a security in the sense where you thought you used to own something on paper. It's a contract, and any discussion to the contrary is false, and it's right there in the current UCC. So what this bill is targeted to do is remove two exceptions that give the secured creditors, banks, the largest banks, who have lent money to your broker or a custodian. There's two exceptions in your current statute that give those lenders priority to the investor's assets in an insolvency situation. So without the knowledge and consent of the investors of Tennessee, they could lose their securities entitlement, which is tied to the security they thought they bought, but that's a different issue. So they can lose their security entitlement to this bank, this creditor, to pay the debt of somebody else that the investor didn't even know about, didn't consent to. And so we just fundamentally think that's wrong. We think there's additional things that we need to look at, but first and foremost, we just want to restore some property rights to the people of Tennessee. And that's sort of the summation, so we'd be happy to answer any questions. I'm assuming there are some.
Thank you. And members, we got one on the list so far, and Representative Parkinson, you're recognized for Mr. Grande or Mr. Webb.
Thank you. Which is which again? I'm sorry. Grande? Webb? Okay. All right.
And Mr. Webb, just make sure your red light's on again.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm not going to try to figure out who's from South Dakota or North Dakota and who's from Sweden. Take it for the team, but I do have a question, but after I finish the question, I do want you to finish your explaining everything. I think it's important for the people. I honestly think it's important for the people of the country to hear what you're saying, because it was all new to me and a shock to me. When I heard testimony the first time, being a person that has invested in stocks, and to learn that the only thing I have is entitlement to what I spent money on. But what I want to know is this: at that higher level, where the pool of the properties are. What are they doing with those? What are they doing with that? Are they making money off of that? That's what I want to know.
It's use of the securities as collateral without restriction. So now this change in the UCC was in '94. Mm-hmm. It took a number of years for it to be implemented in all 50 states. Coincident with that, we saw the massive growth in the derivatives complex. Now, a derivative, it's kind of an intimidating word. What's a derivative? A derivative is just a contract written describing the behavior of something else. So derivative instruments always were contracts that would have had a weak standing in an insolvency. And what's been done here is to take what had been property, where people could have gotten it's called revindication, taken back their own securities. Those are now contractual claims, but the collateral is being used within the derivatives complex, and those were contracts, but the secured creditors there now have what's called super priority to those pooled assets. And it's only the biggest banks that have this super priority to take the assets out of these pools. And what we see from this Fed response to the legal certainty group is that the public only gets what's left in the pool after the secured creditors have taken from the pool. And it's very important for people to understand that this is not just individual investors. Think pension funds, investment funds. It includes the biggest, most sophisticated investors. They are told, they want to believe, and they want to believe they can tell their clients that their accounts are segregated. This Fed response makes it clear that that is not operational in the event of insolvency, which is exactly when you would need to have it. So how were they making money out of this? Well, the derivatives complex by a little after 2000 had reached $110 trillion. That was about twice the size of global GDP. So this, by 2007, the financial crisis that was developing then, derivatives had reached 700 trillion. So it had gone from 100 to 700 trillion in 5 years. It's now estimated to be maybe 2 quadrillion, which is about 20 times the size of global GDP. Now, what made that possible was using these vast pools of the client assets as the collateral that is extended under these basically bets, these contracts. And so they're using someone else's collateral for their trades. And that's what has facilitated this massive global bubble that we're in. Mm-hmm. So what we're talking about here, have they made money through that? Yes, but it's about power and control. It is, and they're not going to tell you about this. They're the last people that are going to tell you about this because they are benefiting from using this resource of the public without restriction. And also they have this term FOP, which means free of payment. They can use the collateral from these pools free of payment.
Mm.
And y'all are welcome to go back and forth.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right, now we are joined by David Webb, joining us from Stockholm, Sweden. And hey, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's a lovely Swedish summer here. David, I apologize for getting confused about the time.
Okay, well, there is a pretty significant time difference. I apologize if there's any confusion, but all the same, you're here, and I appreciate you coming on. So we played a good chunk of that video from your testimony before the Civil Justice Subcommittee, and I think that's kind of a good start. I was going to play a few minutes of it anyway to kick off. So we just played a little more, so maybe the audience has a little more understanding to get started with. So I'm just going to turn it over to you. I do want to hit a little bit on the UCC so that people kind of have a good understanding of that, and I'll turn it over to you and let you get started.
That will come in directly to what we're talking about in terms of state actions. And I think what you played there is perfect because it makes it real for people to see that exposition in testimony. And these processes in the states have been hugely important. I think when people read the book or saw the documentary, some part of the mind says, well, maybe this isn't real. But when you see it actually in a bill and being refuted by the banking lobby, it makes it real for people. So I have to say, this all seems pretty scary, but it is really a gift to us because it is something that allows people to see finally that this is real, because it's one aspect of all the things that are arrayed against us that we really can see is irrefutable. And it's actually quite, it's simple what is happening here. And it is something that can unite us. It's an issue that will affect everyone all the way to the top of the system and globally. And it also helps people to understand that the lines being drawn here are not the partisan lines that we're shown by the media, the red states and the blue states and liberals and conservatives. This is about a banking cabal, a very tiny group of people that are behind this. And that banking power controls essentially all governments, all media, except yours. and thank you for that. And what I have found is that I really think we can see that the federal level is so controlled in the US that it will be very difficult to do anything there. And of course, this is true of the EU as well, totally unaccountable. And this subversion of property rights was done at the local level. So it was done first in all 50 states through the Uniform Commercial Code, but then essentially this was explained to the EU. The EU was leaned on to conform to this, and so they did it very similarly by subverting the local law in each country in Europe, and it took some time to do that. So our hope is really to begin unwinding this at the local level where people can face up to this. And it's starting to happen, and it's very exciting. And the first action was in South Dakota in February this year, and that was a bill brought by Julie Auk, who, it's interesting, is actually a registered rep who has clients. And she understood that she could have, of course, responsibility to her clients in this and liability. So she became personally concerned about this. In South Dakota, we had the opportunity, so in the first instance, of seeing the response of the banking lobby to this and how they subverted the process. And so it's actually good to have gone through that. And really what they did was they had a hearing in the House, and they allowed the people that were driving this were Julie Auk and an attorney named Don Grandy, who is in North Dakota. his wife, Betty Grandy, has been a state legislator in North Dakota. So they have experience with this. He has experience with the UCC. He has written the amendments, which are actually very simple. It's surprisingly simple to revert this, and I'll explain that. When you look at the UCC, it says that, let's see, I'm looking at what you have up here, but let me just speak to it. Right. So there's a section that says that entitlement holders have priority over the claims of secured creditors of the intermediary, which is what you would hope. The entitlement holders have priority to their own assets ahead of the creditors of the intermediary. And that is what was used by the Uniform Law Commission to sell the amendments originally in 1994, that this was about protecting investors. But as we often see with this inversion that they employ, there was an exception to that. So you had to read to the bottom of the paragraph and then go to another section to see the exception. And the exception is that if the secured creditor of the intermediary has control, the secured creditor always has priority over the client, over the entitlement holder. That, as it turns out, is a huge exception that is operative all the time. So let me explain. When we had securities that were in paper form, it was very clear who had control. If you had the certificate, you had control. By going to dematerialization, it created an opportunity to fuzzy up where the control is. And in the system as we have it, control always resides elsewhere than with the beneficial owner, the entitlement holder. Control is a concept in bankruptcy that means that the creditor has the power to sell the asset. And given that the securities are held in this indirect holding system, that control is always elsewhere. There's a second exception, which is that if the creditor is a creditor of a clearing entity, that creditor always has priority over the entitlement holders. And this is very important because the collateral is being used as the underpinning of the derivatives complex, where these are all held within clearing entities all the time. So that's where the collateral is. So it is certain creditors that will be able to take the collateral out of these pools in the event of the failure of the central clearing counterparties. Now we go back to South Dakota. What they did is they allowed a few minutes for Julie Auk and for Don Grandy to speak. And then they brought up a whole line of bank lobbyists who pointed to the first statement in the code that the entitlement holders have priority and just stopped there. Said there's nothing to see here. And this was done a couple of times, saying clearly the entitlement holders have priority, end of story. Don and Julie had no opportunity to rebut that, to refute it. They ended the hearing. Then they were able to get a sufficient number of legislators to force the bill back onto the floor a second time, because there were, I'd say, a large number of legislators that understood this and were very interested. And then once they got it onto the floor, again, they used a kind of procedural tactic. So it was really the leadership in South Dakota, in the legislature that worked with the banking lobbyists to prevent it from being heard. So what they did was they gave a very short period of time for the sponsors to be able to stand up and say something. And if they tried to speak to the issues, the speaker said, speak to the motion, not to the issues.
Yep.
Essentially, they were not allowed to talk. And then the leadership basically stood up and said, look, this has been thoroughly examined in committee. There's nothing to hear here. Stop wasting the people's time. And they killed it. So that's how it was done in South Dakota. Now we get to Tennessee, which was the next month in March. And I have to say, so I was there I was in South Dakota, and I was there in Tennessee. Obviously, you see the hearing. This is the very significant thing that happened. I have to say the legislators in Tennessee are real people. They are authentic people. So you have a lot to work with there. I think I was very impressed. And it was very moving to me the way people would meet with us and the genuine interest and hear what we had to say. That is enormously important. We were treated very kindly. And you see what happened in that hearing. Now, this is very significant. So they passed the bill 6-1. And there was then to be a Senate hearing. And they could have made that difficult for Don and I were there to testify. They accelerated the Senate hearing to the next day. So they made it easy for us to be there. They could have not done that.
Right.
And then in the Senate hearing, the bill was passed unanimously, very quickly. There was no need to even testify. So there was this incredible momentum behind this. Now, Betty Grandy pointed out at that point that the Senate Republican majority leader voted for the bill. And in the hearing that you've just heard, the chairman of the Black Caucus, a Democrat, also voted for the bill. And as Betty said, this is now of national significance because this is a people issue. It's a nonpartisan issue like nothing else. So it really is overcoming this divide and rule partisanship. So what then happened after that, so it had passed the House subcommittee hearing, which is what you heard there. It passed the full Senate the next day. So it would have gone to the floor of the Senate. There was going to be one more full House committee hearing the following week. So Don and I stayed for that because it was just that important. And we were going through the process of meeting with every representative on that committee. And again, it's a very positive thing that people met with us and they took the time and they were thoughtful about it. And we went through the Monday of that week, and then something changed on the next day, on Tuesday. And we could see that the people we met with were, I would say, frightened at that point. Something had changed so that they had been told this is not going to be allowed to happen. And then we were told that we should meet with the treasurer of the state. And then it turned out that there was a meeting happening later that day where the treasurer is going to meet with Bud Halsey, who was the sponsor of the bill, to explain that this had to go to summer study, which was explained to us as a way to kill a bill.
Yep.
And we'll see whether it is killed. But so we went to that meeting, Don Grandy and I would say it was a very moving thing to me because the state treasurer was there, his chief of staff, Don and I. There was a citizen of Tennessee who's a former investment banker who came to the meeting, who understands the issue and was taking us around to meet his representatives. So this is the kind of thing that people have done, that have gotten engaged in this. So he was there, and two bank lobbyists were sitting on a little love seat next to me, literally the love seat. And the moving thing to me was we were allowed to have a full discussion, and no one was trying to keep me from speaking, and the treasurer really thoroughly heard me out, and he was kind about it. It was not it had a nice feeling to it. It was not a confrontational thing at all. And but there was a kind of I would say sadness about it, that there was just an understanding that this wasn't going to happen. It was going to go to summer session, and so that's what happened the next day. But in the full hearing, it was clear it was not going to be allowed to be heard. But we had another opportunity there for very important exposition, because the banking lobbyists, again, they have 2 points. One, this is so in the hearing, maybe, I don't know if you heard Andrew Guggenheim, who's with the Security Industry Financial Markets Association. So he testified. So this is their big gun that they're bringing in, Andrew Guggenheim. And he basically said, there is no change in property rights. There has been no change in property rights, which is absolutely false. One can see that. So that's the first thing they fall back on, is saying there has been no change in property rights. The second thing that was brought up by his colleague is that this is about margin loans, that the use of the collateral relates to clients that have margin accounts. These are the only points they could make. Now, one can see in the code itself that it clearly is about creditors of the intermediary. It's not about creditors of the client. If you have a margin account, you have creditors. And margin accounts are something that have existed for many, many decades. This is so long before these changes to the Uniform Commercial Code, people had margin accounts. That isn't something that was enabled by this subversion through the Uniform Commercial Code. So
I do have a question. So what are they saying about the exceptions? I mean, what's their excuse on the exception?
They do not. They just are silent about it.
Because the exceptions pretty much make the main statement moot. I mean,
yes. Yeah. They are it. So again, it is plain as day, and they cannot refute it. This is why it is very important exposition. This is why I say it's like a gift to us to have had this testimony, and for everybody to be able to see this is absolutely real, and they cannot refute it. They cannot speak to the issues. So the other very important thing here is at the end of the, so the treasurer had intervened because he was told by the banking lobby, this is what I was told. He was told by the banking lobby that if these changes were made, no financial services would be, basically services would be withdrawn from the state. The state would be punished. They would withdraw financial services from the state. and based on the argument that you've now none of our agreements work because you've made this change, so the state won't be able to do business with any financial services firms. But let me finish this. So in the Senate testimony, this bank lobbyist finishes by saying that if you make this change, no financial services firm will do business in the state, and they will not do business with any other firm that is doing business in the state. And then he finished it up by saying this would be bad for depository trust corp. So how could it be allowed? He literally said that in testimony.
So before you explain the depository trust corps and how underfunded they are, if I read, and I can't remember what site I read it on, I looked up some of the stuff about the UCC. And, you know, the UCC, the one thing about it is, you know, is states, even though most states have adopted it, and they've all adopted this rule, states do have the ability within, they don't have to adopt everything. As a matter of fact, I had read somewhere that I think it was Article 2, which is completely different than Article 8, but I think Louisiana has never adopted Article 2. And states do have the ability to make some adjustments. They don't have to adopt everything that comes out from the UCCC. And has any state ever been, hey, why, you know, you're not playing the game well enough, so we're going to cut off your financial services? And who is threatening? Who would be the entity that would cut those services off?
Well, I think it's an empty threat. It's intimidation. And so people within the state are going to have to decide whether they like being intimidated or not. But the lines are being drawn. And I think someone could explain to them that there is something called RICO. There are racketeering laws, and that if they actually attempted to do this, they would be prosecuted. That's what would happen. Somebody needs to explain that.
I like that. So continue on with was it the DTC that?
Yeah, well, you know, depository trust is the entity that where literally all securities in the United States, and of course securities held in the U.S. system by entities outside the United States as well, they're all held in these vast pools at Depository Trust Corp. And depository trust serves its owners, not the public. It serves the cabal that controls the Fed and the Bank of England and, you know, all the private central banks. So they have had the free use of these vast pools of collateral, free of payment, without restriction. That's what this was all about. So the real concern that I think we have to have at this point is what would happen in a financial collapse. And that's when this sleight of hand really allows the taking of all the underlying assets. I think, as a friend of mine said, you know, if they weren't going to use the gun, why did they install the trigger? You know, it's there.
Right.
So I think it's very much part of a global hybrid war strategy to comprehensively take assets, and I call this the Great Taking 2.0. The Great Taking 1.0 is the Great Depression, when people lost everything that was encumbered with any amount of debt. That will happen if this all goes off. That will happen this time as well. But we have this improvement this time around in the Great Taking 2.0, which is even your financial assets, which you believe you own free and clear, through this subterfuge will be taken. And
how will they do that? How will they be able to take something that I already own?
Well, because you do not have a direct property right to those securities. So this is a very simple way to see it. When securities were personal property, which they were for 400 years, from the beginning, from the invention of securities, they were, if your intermediary, a custodian holding your shares, if they became insolvent, that was not your problem. It was absolutely not your problem. You were bulletproof. They had to return your securities, and if they did not, that was theft. So it never should have happened. So the public was fully protected when we had property rights to securities. So the first step was to dematerialize so that you no longer had a certificate. But even then, there were countries that did that in such a way to assure property rights. Sweden had done that, to assure that even though they were held in electronic form, they were specifically numbered and identified to each person. And so Sweden was identified as a problem. And the law had to be changed here to conform to this. So the collateral, so it is held in pooled form. You don't have a direct property right, and that's at the other end of the system, I include in the book this chart from a Bank for International Settlements document that was about 10 years ago, showing the flow of collateral from globally, from equity trading desks, from custodians, through a collateral management system, and then on to the central clearing counterparties. So this is fully developed. This has been in place for a long time. And they actually label essentially the public, all these different entities that provide the securities. Those are the collateral givers. The chart shows that, collateral givers. And at the bottom are the collateral takers. So that's really irrefutable. The collateral is flowing to the central clearing counterparties. And this document discusses that particularly in a crisis, this will be operate on an automated basis so that more and more collateral is swept to the central clearing counterparties. The other important thing is that the last financial crisis, the great financial crisis, was used to drive an imperative to centrally clear all derivatives, so as you looked at Depository Trust Corp, Depository Trust has two of the most significant central clearing counterparties. The total capital of Depository Trust is just a few $1 billion. That is nothing. And there has been discussion within the industry for a number of years now that central clearing counterparties could fail. And Depository Trust has actually planned and pre-funded a new central clearing counterparty when this fails. So what happens when it fails? It means that so now all these contracts that institutions have used to, let's say, hedge their downside. We're at the peak of this very frothy bubble now, and there are institutions that believe that they have hedged their downside risk. But if the central clearing counterparties fail, they have no counterparty to honor those contracts. But the biggest banks have super priority that their contracts, they will be able to take collateral behind their contracts. So that is really how the transmission will work. That in a systemic failure, the collateral in these pools are taken by just the biggest banks that are orchestrating things behind the derivatives complex. So not all secured creditors have this protection. It's only the biggest banks that have this super priority.
Who are these biggest banks that have this priority?
Well, the clearest is J.P. Morgan Chase, which has been for decades behind the planning and implementation of this. So think J.P. Morgan Chase.
Okay. Now, since '94, and of course we had the crisis, the financial crisis in '08, created crisis. And so were there any examples of this, what they changed in '94, the effects that it may have had during the '08?
Yes. So I mean, this has come up a number of times in discussion, and I talk about it in the book. The Lehman Brothers was very significant, and as a demonstration of this, and essentially they cemented the case law behind this with Lehman Brothers. And people get confused about it because they say, well, the retail clients got their assets back. So the important thing to understand is that prior to these changes, if the broker failed, you would just say, I'm sorry, you're out of business. Here's where you transfer my securities. And that did not happen in Lehman Brothers. When Lehman Brothers failed, all clients were encumbered in the bankruptcy estate. And the analogy I would use is if you step out of your house in the morning, imagine you're in this terrible financial crisis. You might want to have access to your account. So by analogy, you step out of your house in the morning and your car is gone. You need it to go to work. And after a couple of months, the police bring a car back and say, well, here's a car. And now, does that mean that your car was not stolen? Of course not. Your car. So that's what happened to people. They lost access to their accounts. The retail business was sold, and we were in a period where they were able to pump the bubble up again. But the real hardship, and this is very telling, it was with the big sophisticated clients that were hurt badly. So the big boys were not able to protect themselves. Now, what happened there? Again, imagine you're at in a terrible collapse, and these institutions had collateral that they were going to use in the crisis. And when Lehman failed, they found that their collateral was tied up in Lehman's bankruptcy. Now, how did that happen? Well, J.P. Morgan, there's J.P. Morgan, was the custodian for the client assets that was also the secured creditor that took the client assets in the bankruptcy. And that is no longer fraud. So the bankruptcy case that these clients, of course, were trying to get their assets back. And this bankruptcy case, which was heard in the Southern District of New York, which is Manhattan, this was occurring 5 years after the bankruptcy. They had still not had recovery. And the bankruptcy judge found that the only issue was whether J.P. Morgan was a member of the protected class, and they use that term. And the judge found that J.P. Morgan, as a member of the protected class, being one of the biggest banks, was surely entitled to take the client assets because this is exactly what is intended to happen, particularly in a financial crisis. It's right there in the decision.
Wow. The top is protected. Everybody else is out of luck.
Yes. So it's all been demonstrated, but people get confused about it because another bubble was blown after that. And they'll say, well, eventually everybody was made whole. But for some entities, it took 13 years. For these institutions, they were still fighting about it after 5 years. The key thing is that all the principles were demonstrated here, that you no longer have a direct property right. What people used to have, it was called revindication. You could take back your own asset immediately. We no longer have that. And the other thing I have to mention here that the banking lobbyists never mention, or the Uniform Law Commission never mentions, is this Fed response to the legal certainty group,
Yep.
which is just, again, an enormous gift to us that we have this, because this is not conjecture. It's a primary source document, and this was prepared. So let me explain. What was happening was the EU was being pressured by the US State Department to conform European law to this system. And that was beginning just at the time of in the aftermath of the dot-com bubble and bust. And in 2005, there was a group that had been formed called the Legal Certainty Group. Now, what do they mean by legal certainty? It meant providing legal certainty that the secured creditors get the assets, just like what we saw with J.P. Morgan.
Right. I think we've got some proof slides on that. And also what you're talking about and some of the other things that you've mentioned, we will have them on our site for anybody to come and look at. I encourage everybody to read the PDF that's on Mr. Webb's site, which we'll post as well. A lot of good information, and it's all documented, as he said. So please continue.
Thank you. So the Legal Certainty Group was charged with, making certain that essentially J.P. Morgan was protected and other entities like it in the event of a systemic collapse. And so they wrote this questionnaire to the Fed, basically saying, you've done this already. Show us how it's done. And so attorneys for the New York Fed, which is the Fed, the New York Fed is basically the Fed. This is the business end of the Fed. And attorneys for the Fed wrote a detailed legal response specifically about the operation of Article 8 and 9, which none of the banking lobbyists will mention, the Uniform Law Commission will not mention. And one of the amazing things in this is that the Fed explains that even in the event of fraud, the secured creditors keep the client assets.
Wow. And the law that the House bill you were there in support of, House Bill 2806, and that's also on the website. There's the link to it. I can read off just a little bit of it so everybody knows, because it's gone to summer study. So it is dead one way or the other, because next session is a new session. So they'll have to bring the bill back either way. No matter what they say during summer session, they'll have to bring another bill back. But we're going to have to demand they bring this bill back, because a lot of times summer study is the place where bills go to die. But just looking at the first portion of it, and it changes it from the UCC code, which is currently the J.P. Morgan Protection Code, to it starts off with acquisition of a security entitlement from securities let me back up here. It basically changes it to where the local law of the entitlement holder's jurisdiction governs. Whether you're talking acquisition of a security entitlement from the securities, the rights and duties of the securities intermediary and entitlement holders rising out of a security entitlement. Basically, all the things that the UCC does this, I won't say everything, but related to Title 8 and related to you having, rather than property, having a mere entitlement. That's what this law is designed to change. And hey, the good thing is we can do it at state level. This is not a federal law. This is something that states can change, and that's the good thing about it, is that states can change it. But I would encourage everybody to look at that legislation. It's on the site, and I'll turn it back to you.
Well, this is Don Grandy really worked out the solution, which is elegant. It's so simple. So the first thing is simply to strike the exceptions. So the code says entitlement holders have priority to their own assets. So entitlement holders have priority ahead of secured creditors of the intermediary. End. Period. No exceptions. It's just striking what came after that. But as David, as you were just saying, the other part of this is to revert the place of law to the state of Tennessee, or whichever state is undertaking this. And because what they've done, and I saw this in what they did in Europe. See, the problem they had in subverting this in Europe was there was strong property right law in each nation state in Europe. So they had to come up with a workaround where the place of law is the place of the intermediary, basically, not the place of the client, the place of the intermediary. So what will happen with institutions and individuals in the U.S. is the place of law is New York. It's not Tennessee. So if you make this very simple change to strike the exceptions, you also want to revert the place of law back to Tennessee, and that gives you a leg to stand on. The other thing, people, the banking lobby wants you to believe that this will be bad for business somehow to do this. I think, again, it's a mind trick. It's just intimidation. The reality is that everything worked just fine before these changes to the Uniform Commercial Code. People could have margin accounts. They had direct property rights to their securities. They were fully protected. It's not as if frogs are going to fall from the sky if this is reverted, but quite the opposite. The way I would put it is if you think of this, that all these securities are in these vast pools and everyone else is in the net, if Tennessee were to revert this law so that Tennessee institutions and individuals in Tennessee are now clearly ahead of the creditors of intermediaries to their own assets, to get their own assets back, that will be unique in the world. And it will actually jump institutions in Tennessee ahead of everyone else in the financial system to these pooled assets, because they will have priority to get their own assets back first. So it's actually a massively favorable position. The other thing, by analogy, when Julie Auk was talking about why she was doing this in South Dakota, and I was thinking about, again, it's a mind trick. People in the securities industry, financial services industry, are tricked into believing that their interests are somehow aligned with these banking powers. And nothing could be further from the truth. So here's an analogy. Let's say when a medieval town was built, the castle was up on the hill, the Lord was in the castle, again, think J.P. Morgan, and other entities like that, and they would build a town wall, city wall, with quite a bit of size inside of that, and invite people to settle inside that wall. And people within the wall would think, I'm so fortunate that the Lord is protecting me. When the real strategic reason was so that any marauders, any attacking army would have to go through the townspeople before getting to the keep on the hill. The financial services industry, those are the innocent townspeople that think that they are being protected by the Lord on the hill, when it's actually the other way around. The people in the financial services industry are really being set up as patsies when this fails, because the displeasure of the public will be visited upon them.
Absolutely. So, as far as some big event that would trigger this, I mean, you know, we have a lot of things going on in the world today, and we have financial issues besides this with all of our debt and spending. Do you see this is something that's eventually going to happen, or do you see a specific trigger setting off the great taking?
I think there are many possible triggers. It could be everything from the Strait of Hormuz being closed, and or one theory is that with the Ukraine war, they're to some degree, or actually freezing Russian assets, which are held at Euroclear, which is one of the biggest depositories, and it's setting up a situation where the Russians can retaliate and pull collateral out of the system. So this is one theory that so you have things happening in the Middle East. This will all happen within the context of a global war. So they will do this at a time that we're worried about not just our IRAs, we're worried about a lot of other things happening. So if you think about what was happening in the first part of the 20th century, it's within the context of all kinds of threats. This is full spectrum. But the gift here is that we can see this clearly. We can see this and really understand it, and understand that this is not being done for our benefit, quite the opposite. And finally, to face up to it. And I think it's very important that we drive through this to understand that it's really the people that control it's really the banking cartel that controls, all the, if you feel threatened, it's because you are being threatened. There are lots of threats arrayed against you, and they are all being funded. And how are they being funded? It's not your tax dollars. That's part of it. That's part of it. It's part of it that have, your tax dollars certainly aren't going to be used to help you. They're going to be used for something else. But there is a vast amount of control that comes from the power of the central banks to control all of the money creation. So ultimately, if you want all these threats against you to stop, it's not a matter of auditing the Fed or writing to your congressman. The central, we have to understand, we all have to wake up and understand that the money system cannot be controlled by these people any longer. They are not benevolent.
Well, hey, I really appreciate what you do. I encourage everybody to visit your site. I think we have that on the slide. And I've read most of the book. I need to read all of it, but really good information. And hey, if those of you who haven't read it, it lays it out. It's not questionable once you read it. You will see that everything he has talked about is spot on. And I would also say the reaction of the banking lobby and our leadership, unmentioned leadership in the state putting a squash on this, that tells you a lot right there. So hey, thank you for coming on. I do appreciate your time, and I appreciate what you do, and we've got your information up there on the board, and I'd love to have you back sometime.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you so much. Let me just say one thing. It isn't clear that this will be in the summer study. It seems that may not happen. So they said it would be referred to summer study, but it is yet to be scheduled and it may not happen. So that is something that people can do within the state, in addition to saying, look, this bill is going to be brought back, but to communicate with people in the Congress to say, this needs to be studied.
Absolutely.
So thank you to all the people and I think there are very good people in the state to work with. They need the support and encouragement.
Yeah. I don't think there will be anything in summer study until after the primaries, August 1st. That's what I'm hearing, and so that would be my guess, especially in an election year. Well, hey, thanks again. I appreciate you coming on with us, and apologize for any confusion on the time, but a lot of great information.
I got confused. I'm so sorry, David.
Okay. Well, hey, you still put out great information, and love to have you back. I want to thank everybody for taking time to watch the program today. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons. And tomorrow night, we will have Kathy Henners. She'll be here to talk to us about the threat in our backyard. That'll be 7 p.m. tomorrow night. And that's it for today from Paris, Tennessee, that is.